Hey everybody, if you're watching this video, I hope it means that you are interested in digging deeper into the book of John and learning a little bit more about some of the history, some of the context, and in this video in particular talking about the regions that we run into of ancient Palestine in the book of John. Israel is not its own nation at the time of the book of John. That time has long passed, and now it's a territory or province of the Roman Empire. And the world that Jesus is walking around in the book of John can be broken into three different regions. I'm going to have a map up on the screen here in just a second to talk about them. But before I do, just think if you've ever lived in a rural area and then you've moved into a bigger city. You kind of see that the differences of what you are, like your day-to-day life is like, and sort of the concerns of the other people around you are different based on where you live. If you live, I'm from the northern part of the state of Minnesota, and we don't, up there, we care about what's going on in like the big city in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, the metro area. We care about that stuff, and we would take trips down here for different reasons, but at the same time, we're pretty concerned with what we have going on up there, too. We're concerned with our own sort of day-to-day life and the things, the industries up there, the jobs that a lot of people have because they live in that region. And the same is true when you live in the big city. Now, the big city definitely has a bearing on the rural areas that are kind of detached from it. That's definitely true, but it's not the space unless you got to go down there for some particular reason. And we would do that when I lived up in northern Minnesota. We'd come down to the Twin Cities for whatever. The state capital's here. There are big businesses here. The pro sports teams are located here. But otherwise, we kind of kept to ourselves up there. And it's kind of similar in the book of John when we come across Jesus and his interaction with the different regions. So I'm going to put a map on the screen here, and you can kind of follow along with me as I walk through the three main regions of Palestine that Jesus will go to. So let's start up in the north with Galilee. Galilee is about a 3 days journey from the city of Jerusalem. And so when you hear that Jesus is in the city of Cana or Capernaum or Bethsaida or Nazareth or the Sea of Galilee, you know that Jesus is in Galilee, the northern part of ancient Israel. And if you live up in this region, you are not super concerned about the sort of political concerns or even sort of the really religious concerns around the temple that happen in the southern part. You're more focused on following God by trying to stay pure in your own context. You're not worried about disputes that go on in the temple or around like how do we follow Torah or the law in a really specific way. You're worried about trying to follow God well because you have got like pagan cities that are nearby you. You've got pagans who you maybe sell, you catch fish and you sell them to pagans who live in a city that's just on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And you've got to worry about staying distinct and following God well, even though so many of the people you come into contact with are non-Jewish. And so that's a big part of what it means to live in Galilee. There's not big cities up there. There's not as many rich people up there. You have a lot more fishermen and farmers maybe in that area. And so, like, you have to worry about that stuff. And so when Jesus is in that region, that's what the people up there kind of care about. They're not necessarily concerned with some of the things that the people that Jesus will run into when he's in Jerusalem are worried about. Let's actually jump down to that southern part on the map here, and that's the region of Judea. Now you'll notice the big cities here are Jerusalem and Bethany, and Bethlehem is actually located down there as well, even though we actually don't spend any time in the book or in Bethlehem in the book of John. We actually spent a lot of time in Jerusalem. Now Jerusalem is an important place because it's the capital of Israel and the temple is located there. Now we split up the kind of political world and the economic world and the religious world into three different parts, and there are different leaders in each of those fields. The economy is sort of governed by the big businesses here. So what's going on at Target? What's going on at 3M? What's going on at Medtronic? Like, we're worried about that stuff, and the people who are leading that are the CEOs of those companies, or the bosses there. And then on the other hand, we have the politicians who are worried about what's going on at the state capitol. And then we have religious leaders who are worried about what's going on in their churches. And these are all three are very distinct. At least we want to keep them that way. They don't actually work out to be that distinct in practice as much as we would hope that they do. And I don't even know if I'm convinced that we actually should separate these things out as much as we do, or at least in the ways that we talk about. But this is however we approach this is not how you would approach it in the ancient world. You would combine all three of those things into sort of one conglomerate, and that is really focused on the temple. The temple is where worship of God takes place. And so because worship of God is central to everything that you do in Israel, the people who are sort of telling everybody else, this is what worship is going to look like, this is how sacrifice is going to take place, those people end up having a lot of control or power. And kind of a side note to talk about sort of the economic impact of the temple, your priest is also your local butcher. The people who, like you take these animals to the temple, a part of them gets slaughtered maybe and sacrificed, and then the rest of it gets sold out. So the people who are trained to be butchers are also your priests. So there's kind of this economic concern that's taking place all around the temple too. It's really complicated. We don't necessarily need to get into all of it. If you watch the video where I talk about the chief priests and sort of their role, you'll get a little bit more of what this looks like. But that's all I'll say for now. That's all. But that's a big concern of the southern part of Israel in Judea. All right, so I skipped over this middle part here, and I'll tell you why here. That region is called Samaria. If you've ever heard the parable of the Good Samaritan, which Jesus doesn't actually tell in the book of John, but if you've ever heard that parable, Jesus is referring to someone from the region of Samaria. Now, one scholar who I read on this called Samaria, if you're a Jew at least, hostile territory. And why is that? Why is Samaria hostile? And why in between sort of the north and southern part of Israel, if we can call it that, do you have this territory that's made up of a different group of people? So here's the reason, as best as we can tell at least. You have a group of people, and again, this is a little bit wonky, but if you're watching this video, it's because you are okay with me getting into the weeds on stuff a little bit. You have in the ancient sort of, going back, in the book of Daniel, we talked about how Israel splits into two nations, the northern and the southern nation. Now, the book of Daniel is concerned with the exile of the southern nation, which has gone into exile to Babylon. But about 100 years before that, the northern kingdom goes into exile to the nation of Assyria. And what happens is a bunch of other pagan nations, Assyria brings in a bunch of other pagan people to live in this region. And what happens, and 2 Kings 17 tells us some of this stuff, that a lot of the Israelites who live there sort of intermarry and sort of sully their worship of God with the worship of other pagans. And so they're cutting off sort of their ethnic bloodlines by marrying these other pagan nations, and they're sort of colluding their worship with these other nations as well. And it creates a sort of mixture of worship and people in this area of Samaria. And so if you're a person who lives in Galilee or Judea, you might look at people in Samaria as if they're kind of like mutts, kind of half-breeds in a sense. And you can understand why Samaritans might not like Jews, because they would find that very offensive, right? They think that they see themselves as having direct ancestry into Israel, but maybe they have their own sort of ways of worshiping God, and it creates a lot of infighting. And so because of all this, if you're traveling from Jerusalem up to Galilee or vice versa, and you decide to go through Samaria, it might not. It might be a bit of a bumpy ride sometimes. Obviously, these three regions need to kind of live in peace with one another. It's not like they're fighting wars against each other or something like that. But they're not necessarily the best of friends either. And so in chapter 4 of John, when Jesus spends a long period of time talking with a Samaritan woman, you could see where that might be a bit of a scandalous thing because of all this sort of hostility towards the different nations. And sometimes to avoid any of this trouble, you might not pass right through Samaria if you're going from Galilee to Judea, which is normally about a 3-day trip to go from the north to the south. It's not like a huge deal. For us, a 3-day travel is like a big deal, but for people in this time period, that wouldn't be the case. And if you lived in Galilee, you would go down to Jerusalem once a year at least for different festivals that take place. And we see Jesus make some pilgrimages like this with his family also. You could avoid Samaria by maybe traveling along the coastline or maybe even hopping in a boat and going up the Mediterranean if you wanted to, but that's obviously a lot more inconvenient. So you're going to have to travel through Samaria sometimes, even though that's a little bit uncomfortable. So there's a little bit of a snapshot at some of the regions that you will encounter as you walk through the book of John. I hope that that's helpful for you. And if you enjoyed this video, I have 3 more that kind of walk through the different people that live in first century Palestine that Jesus encounters, or one that talks about sort of the timeline of events and actually tracks Jesus's movements through these different regions. So if you like this video, go ahead and check those out as well.